AZ-204 Developing Solutions for Microsoft Azure as an intermediate level exam. Passcert team new updated Azure Developer AZ-204 exam dumps, which will guide you on how you can clear the Microsoft AZ-204 exam easily. Passcert offers the Azure Developer AZ-204 exam dumps according to the latest syllabus to ensure your success in first attempt with high scores. Questions 1. You deploy an Azure App Service web app. You create an app registration for the app in Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, and Twitter. The app must authenticate users and must use SSL for all communications. The app must use Twitter as the identity provider. You need to validate the Azure AD request in the app code. What should you validate? A. HTTP response code. B. ID token header. C. ID token signature. D. Tenant ID. Answer B. Questions 2. You develop a serverless application using several Azure functions. These functions connect to data from within the code. You want to configure tracing for an Azure Function app project. You need to change configuration settings in the hostJSON file. Which tool should you use? A. Azure Portal. B. Azure PowerShell. C. Azure Functions Core Tools, Azure CLI. D. Visual Studio. Answer A. Questions 3. You are developing a Java application that uses Cassandra to store key and value data. You plan to use a new Azure Cosmos DB resource and the Cassandra API in the application. You create an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, group named Cosmos DB Creators to enable provisioning of Azure Cosmos accounts, databases, and containers. The Azure AD group must not be able to access the keys that are required to access the data. You need to restrict access to the Azure AD group. Which role-based access control should you use? A. Document DB Accounts Contributor. B. Cosmos Backup Operator. C. Cosmos DB Operator. D. Cosmos DB Account Reader. Answer C. Questions 4. You are developing an application that uses Azure Blob Storage. The application must read the transaction logs of all the changes that occur to the blobs and the blob metadata in the storage account for auditing purposes. The changes must be in the order in which they occurred, include only create, update, delete, and copy operations and be retained for compliance reasons. You need to process the transaction logs asynchronously. What should you do? A. Process all Azure Blob Storage events by using Azure Event Grid with a subscriber Azure Function app. B. Enable the change feed on the storage account and process all changes for available events. C. Process all Azure Storage Analytics logs for successful blob events. D. Use the Azure Monitor HTTP Data Collector API and scan the request body for successful blob events. Answer B. Questions 5. You have an Azure App Services web app, Azure SQL Database Instance, Azure Storage Account and an Azure Redis Cache instance in a resource group. A developer must be able to publish code to the web app. You must grant the developer the contribute role to the web app. You need to grant the role. What two commands can you use? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. New Azure role assignment. B. As role assignment create. C. As role definition create. D. New Azure role definition. Answer: A, B. Question 6. An organization hosts web apps in Azure. The organization uses Azure Monitor. You discover that configuration changes were made to some of the web apps. You need to identify the configuration changes. Which Azure Monitor log should you review? A. App Service Environment Platform Logs. B. App Service App Logs. C. App Service Audit Logs. D. App Service Consote Logs. Answer: C. Question 7. You provide an Azure API Management managed web service low clients. The back-end web service implements HTTP Strict Transport Security, HSTS. Every request to the back-end service must include a valid HTTP authorization header. You need to configure the Azure API Management instance with an authentication policy. Which two policies can you use? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Certificate authentication. B. Basic authentication. C. OAuth client credential grant. D. Digest authentication. Answer: C, D. Questions 8. You need to ensure that all messages from Azure Event Grid are processed. What should you use? A. Azure Event Grid Topic. B. Azure Service Bus Topic. C. Azure Service Bus Queue. D. Azure Storage Queue. E. Azure Logic App Custom Connector. Answer: B. Questions 9. You manage a data processing application that receives requests from an Azure storage queue. You need to manage access to the queue. You have the following requirements. Provide other applications access to the Azure queue. Ensure that you can revoke access to the queue without having to regenerate the storage account keys. Specify access at the queue level and not at the storage account level. Which type of shared access signature, SAS, should you use? A. Service SAS with a stored access policy. B. Account SAS. C. User delegation SAS. D. Service SAS with ad hoc SAS. Answer: A. Questions 10. You are developing an Azure messaging solution. You need to ensure that the solution that meets the following requirements. Provide transactional support. Provide duplicate detection. Store the messages for an unlimited period of time. Which two technologies will meet the requirements? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Azure Service Bus Queue. B. Azure Storage Queue. C. Azure Service Bus Topic. D. Azure Event Hub. Answer. A. C.